Well, good afternoon from Sihanoukville, Cambodia. I know I killed that word. I'm on a tour, and we just got back from a land tour in Cambodia, Sihanoukville. One of the things that, and most of you know that, I was in the Air Force from 62 to 68. And I was in Germany, of course, you never know where the Air Force is going to put you. But I also worked for 28 months for the Armed Forces, for an Armed Forces television station in Spangdahlem, Germany. And I had to read the Washington Report, which was President Johnson's White House report to the troops. We had 25,000 within the range of that UHF TV station, Channel 22. And as I read these things, nobody wanted to read it, by the way. It was 5 minutes of teletype, and sometimes the teletype wasn't exactly clear. And then I'm not the best pronunciator in the world, but especially when it comes to the cities or the villages in Vietnam, Da Nang, Phuc Do, Trang, and all those. Hue, I probably said Ho. It was new to me, but on the other hand, what the gist of everything that I read was the fact that President Johnson was between a rock and a hard spot. The domino theory actually started with President Eisenhower, and I truly believe if President Kennedy hadn't been assassinated, that we wouldn't have been in Vietnam. But President Johnson carried it forward. He thought he was being advised by McNamara, former CEO of Ford Motor Company, saying, yeah, if we have 3,000 body dead every day, we can win this war. And then General Westmoreland, who was a good general, and Lyndon Johnson said, can we win this? And he says, yeah, if you give me 660,000 men. And he did. He drafted these youngsters right out of high school. 660,000 in about 18 months from 65, 66, and 67. Of course, I was in the Air Force. I enlisted in 1962. And the mission that I was on was at Spangdahlem. The mission of the base was to deter the Soviets lined up on the East German border, ready to invade West Germany and Europe with nuclear bombs and 16 aircraft. It was we couldn't wear our uniforms off the base. We couldn't take pictures on the base. And it was a 36-month assignment. No trips home, no phone calls home, at $73 a month. And, I lived with 100 other GIs in that barracks, and we learned how to get along with each other. In fact, the roommates, we eventually got a 10 by 20 foot room from a big room of about 20. And who chose to be together? It was me and a fellow from Tuscaloosa, Alabama. He was a Baptist, and a Jewish fellow from New York. His name, and so there was me and a Jewish guy and a Baptist, and we learned to respect each other. We learned a lot from each other, and I learned a lot about the Jewish faith. I really did. I didn't know a thing about it. They're less than 1% of the population. But he could have been with anybody else, but he chose to be with me in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, same as Forrest Gump. Well, anyway, I watched the Vietnam War escalate, and of course, many of the GIs that were in Spangdahlem, they took a tour over in Vietnam. One of the guys wrote back after he arrived, the first day that he arrived in Da Nang, the enemy mortared Da Nang, and he had to get underneath the mattress, his bed mattress, to protect himself. Welcome to Vietnam, the first day. So it was a terrible thing. But one of the things too, and here in Cambodia, and that's what this is. This is a Cambodian elephant. They got a lot of elephants here. I haven't seen any yet. But one of the things that happened, and today, the guide explained that there was this Pol Pot guy that killed about 3 million Cambodians. But going back even further, he was after the Vietnam War ended, I think. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was, or about the same time. I want to talk about what happened to President Johnson when he tried to get, before the election in 1968, was it? When Nixon was running against, was it 68 or 71? Anyway, whenever it was. And he was trying to get the peace accords done, to get the North Vietnamese to come to the table in Paris. And he was almost got it done, except for the fact that Nixon, in his political machine, called up the North Vietnamese and said, "Listen, I'll make you a better deal. Don't invite the president of the United States to don't talk to him. I'll make you a better deal." And of course, Nixon went on to be elected because he said he was going to end the war. That's 1971, was it? Anyway, about that time, at the same time, there was about 25. And I mean, the protests were there was a lot of protests, and there was about 25,000, as I recall, that were killed at that time. Well, so Nixon got elected, and it didn't have. And then what the first thing he did was he took the B-52 bombers and bombed Cambodia. He escalated the war to Cambodia, saying, "Well, the enemy's over there." No, he escalated it to Cambodia. They dropped 2 million tons of bombs from the B-52s and the F-105s that I worked on. There was and the fighters, and they escalated the war, and it killed another 25,000 until he finally stopped it. But when I was talking to this tour guide today in Cambodia, he said that there were millions upon millions of mines that were dropped in Cambodia, and the citizens, people, the farmers, were stepping on these things, and it was killing them. And then finally, and they were there, and that was the purpose. Those bombs didn't blow up things; they planted mines, human mines. So step on one, get blown up, blow off your legs, and kills you. So anyway, another thing that Nixon did too is when the protests were going on, he noticed that the protesters were ex-GIs, the 18-month draftees. They were back in the universities, and 1 out of 5 were addicted to drugs. Now, I want to tell you, and when I was in the Air Force, we didn't have drugs. We had beer and wine and whiskey, but we never had any drugs like cocaine, marijuana, heroin, LSD, and others until the Vietnam War. I talked to a veteran, that was in Germany in 1971. He said every airplane that was coming out of Southeast Asia to Germany, he was stationed in Germany, was loaded with narcotics, illegal narcotics, hidden inside the airplanes. So what Nixon did was he says, I noticed that all these youngsters that are protesting are smoking pot and other drugs, or addicted. So he says, well, we're gonna get even. We're gonna make those drugs a felony, And that includes marijuana. You know, Schedule 1, going to make it so that they have those youngsters that were protesting lost 1,400 of their civil rights and couldn't vote. And he knew that if everybody voted, he couldn't win. So that's how it all started, and that's where we are today. You know, all around in Idaho, you know, the governor says, you know, if you expected somebody to legalize marijuana, you got the wrong governor. And yet they've done it in Washington, Oregon, they've done it in Canada, they've done it in Montana, they've done it in Nevada, and they've even done a limited amount in Utah. What does that tell you about the leadership in Idaho? Here from 1974, and here we are 2025, we've been sending 600,000 youngsters to prison. Gave them a felony. They couldn't vote for 5 years until they had it, expunged. And I noticed a lot of them had tattoos that they got in prison. Because I kept running into them when they ran the voter information booth at Eastern Idaho State Fair. And I asked these youngsters that come by, and I says, are you registered to vote? Says, can't vote because I got a felony. And that's when it all clicked together. You gotta do something about this stuff. And as far as Governor Little's concerned, I think he needs to retire. Get with it. Well, the Cambodian guy today said that those bombs that were dropped by Nixon in Cambodia, there was millions upon millions of these mines. After the war ended, and this guy, Pol Pot, killed 3 million, and he went on to that, but that's a different story. I didn't remember all the details, but he was talking about education. You know, those people out in the country were not educated. And the country is on the mend, but they're still, they're still a poor country. But education-wise, they've improved it. The life expectancy at that time, with all those unexploded mines, was like 35 or 40. And and there was a lot of other things, contributing factors. They had HIV. They had AIDS. And and by the way, I asked the guide about COVID-19. He says, well, we're very proud of our country because we were one of the fewest countries, I think there's 20 million people, that had very, very few COVID cases. And I said, well, how much? How many? And he said, 3,000. The United States had 1.2 million. We had 18% of all the deaths in the world, and we only had 4% of the population because, if you remember, President Truman said, it's a hoax, it's a Democratic hoax. It'll go away, don't worry. Then he gave the testing machines to Putin. He said, don't tell, and Putin said, don't tell anybody. Yeah, he got rid of the agency that was prepared to deal with pandemics. 1.2 million people died because of that guy, Trump. But anyway, the guide went on later, and he was talking about there was all these mines that were blowing up, all these farmers out in the rural areas especially. And the United Nations, them guys, they came in to help rid this countryside of those bombs. He even mentioned Jacqueline Kennedy came to Cambodia. I don't know when he mentioned that, but anyway, and here again, I feel very strongly that had Kennedy not been assassinated, we wouldn't have been in Vietnam. Nope, we would not have. But all this stuff, and so he said the United Nations came in to help Cambodia get rid of these mines. And I've seen YouTube videos on, they've had people going out that were sponsored, and they provided the funds to help the country get rid of the mines. They're still there, but he says, well, only about 30 or 40 people get killed by those mines that were dropped by Nixon's B-52 bombers when he said he was not, when he escalated the war into Cambodia, probably to, to help his donors build more bombs or something. But it's interesting. But the drug thing, and a lot of times I tell people about the drugs. And when the draftees came in, they were given 8 weeks of training, sent on the ship over to Vietnam or on an airplane. They took them to an outpost somewhere and said, okay, this is your tent. Tomorrow morning we're going to get into a helicopter and we're going to go out and search and destroy. We've gotten word that there's only there's 200 enemy, and we're going to fly in 400, so don't worry, we'll be outgunned them 2-1. Well, the other day I went to the Chu Choi a museum of the tunnels that were under that area, Chu Choi, just about 16 or 17 kilometers from Saigon. And I crawled into one of those tunnels. They had an exhibit there. And what they had done is the soil in that area was clay. And they built these tunnels, 130 miles of them. And they lived there. They had lived inside. They had cooking facilities. They had hospitals. I had a nephew in the Green Berets. My dad told me that he was a tunnel rat, and he would go in there. But it was pretty scary because they were booby-trapped. And the network and the system that they had when the B-52s started dropping these 1,000-pound bombs, yeah, it blew a hole, but they weren't in that area. When the bombing went off, it was a carpet bombing, and they knew that they were coming in the morning. They just moved to a different area of the tunnels, and a lot of them survived. They were 30 feet deep, if you can imagine. And I went into one, and it was like 30 feet long to get the experience. And, I could barely squat. And at one point there, as big as I am, I had to actually crawl on my hands and knees to get through that because everybody else was behind on the tour group. But I learned that this was the reason, because when those draftees, the guys that were in those helicopters dropped into landing zones, it wasn't 200 of the enemy, it was 2,000 of the enemy. And they were in killing fields. And then they pick them up after the 2 or 3 hours in the morning, and then they would take them back to their tent, and then they would do the same thing the next day. Well, the enemy made sure they had LSD, marijuana, cocaine, and heroin, and all kinds of drugs, because they were scared shitless. And it was common in wars. Germans used methamphetamines and other drugs to make their troops mean as snakes, fearless, to go lots of miles. So it's not uncommon for for people in war to take drugs. But the thing is, it wasn't the United States that provided those drugs. It was the enemy. And so they'd be all juiced up, and they'd go in there and they'd fight, and then they'd come back. They'd fight and they'd come back, and back to the tent. Never held the land. They'd have to go back and retake it. And of course, we had another illustration in Saigon. That was the War Museum. Remnants, they called it War Remnants. They had United States tanks and helicopters and planes, and they had a tank that was blown up by a mine. And actually, those 750-pound bombs in the bombs, a lot of them were unexploded. So the enemy, the Vietcong and the Vietnamese, North and Vietnam, they would take mainly the peasants, they would make booby traps from those. They just cut them up and then load them with powder, and then they had mines, and they had these open pits. In other words, you'd walk along, and GI, it was covered with leaves in the jungle, and he'd go down through this trap, and they had long spikes about this long, a foot long, and it was like a fish hook. And if he fell into that, one of our guys fell into that thing, there'd be 6 of them that would penetrate the abdomen area, and they couldn't pull him out, because he was stuck. They had spears that if they fell into one of these pits, and you looked at it and you say, my goodness, you can't tell that it's there. And when they did, they were covered with excrement so that they got infections, even if they survived it. A lot of them did, and they cut their legs, all this kind of stuff. And these were just made out of wood and steel rods. And they were planted all over in Vietnam. And they were being planted by these people, the peasants, who were in those caves. And one other thing too, what was the turning point? And the thing is that there's 80 million people, and here we have 600,000 with helicopters flying in and out. There's 80 million people. There was 40 million 40 million in the south and 40 million in the north. And the big turning point was when the monk set himself on fire with gasoline. And the Vietnamese are very religious, and when it comes to things like that, they value life, especially elder life. And this monk was 71 years old. And that was the turning point for a lot of these mothers and Vietnamese mothers who told their sons and daughters, go join the Vietcong or NVA and kill the Americans, get the Americans out of here. So we had policies that continued on. Johnson wouldn't give up, and he believed Westmoreland, give me more troops, give me more troops. Well, hell, when you can't. And I think Kennedy wouldn't have got us into this mess that was started with Eisenhower, the domino theory, and then Nixon just made it awful, lying to voters, saying that he was going to discontinue, or he was going to end the war when he got elected, and actually he escalated the war when he started bombing Cambodia. And that was a terrible thing for these people, which led to this Pol Pot guy that was out in this rural area, and they were all uneducated, and they killed. And I asked the guide, and he says about 2.8 million people died. Remember the movie The Killing Fields? So anyway, this country is they don't talk about the war. They don't want to talk, and they want to look forward. We saw a lot of buildings that were built. They were affected by the COVID happened, and economics. They had corruption. Some of these contractors that built these buildings in anticipation of a great booming economy in Cambodia, they're empty. Lots of them are empty, and they really see the Viking ship. In fact, this guy, there was a tour. He spoke very good English. He was a great guy, and I'll probably post some of the videos I took on this trip. And by the way, this is part of my bucket list. I always wanted to go to Vietnam and this Southeast Asia, because I was reading this. I was interested in it because a lot of the guys that were in Spangdahlem went to Vietnam. And had they not shot down 300 of the F-105s, I might have gone. but I'm not so sure since they had plenty of maintainers. I recommend that if you get a chance to come to Cambodia and Vietnam and see it. Vietnam is it's incredible. They have a form, but the thing is that I wouldn't want to live here in Vietnam because of the communism. They have, you get a knock on the door if you say something wrong. And that's one of the problems. I'm not so sure that the United States isn't heading that way. But it's not guns and all that stuff, and don't take my gun. I was thinking, that's a bunch of crap, You can't, they just knock on the door and then take you to the police station and then you lock you up. And you might even be found guilty before you're there, and they're not gonna come in shooting. They'll catch you down at the gas station. So the point is this, we are really lucky we have a country, but I'm really worried that what's going on with Mr. Bone Spur. And that's what I call him. And for those of you that don't know what that is, and I'll just tell you, when I was in the Air Force, and Donald Trump was 2 years younger than me, his daddy, Fred Trump, bribed a podiatrist to say that he had bone spurs and couldn't be drafted, couldn't serve in the military. 5 of them. He didn't have any bone spurs. That was a bribe in exchange and give this podiatrist a prime office in one of his buildings. His daughter said that. So he's never served military. And that's another thing, here he is commander-in-chief and he has 4,000 missiles at his fingertips. Give me a break. He can set those things off without any permission from Congress or anything. And what is he doing? He's declaring war in Venezuela. All these things. Well, I'll stay on this Cambodian subject. I really recommend that you come if you can. In this particular case, it was Vietcong, and they really they're really good people, and they're trying to build their economy. As he explained it, they've got 3 different. Buddhism, communism, and democracy, and he says right now that they're leaning toward democracy, and which is a good thing, and they want to really do well, and they're willing to open up their arms and say, please come, bring your money, come visit Cambodia, because Thailand, and I haven't been there, that'll be in a couple days, but Thailand, has done very well in doing that, but they never were involved in the war. And the only reason that Cambodia got involved in the war was because of Richard Nixon, when he escalated it after he got elected, and he said he was going to make a better deal with North Vietnam. He was a terrible man, absolutely terrible. And as a result of that, 50 or 25,000 more youngsters died in Vietnam. 55,000. So anyway, I just thought I'd share this story with you because today it was very enlightening and things I didn't know. And this elephant here is, I didn't see an elephant. I saw a lot of poverty. A lot of poverty in Southeast Asia here. The thing is, he was very, very proud of the fact that they have like 1% unemployment. Everybody's working. We went to a fish market. Squid. Oh, what an experience that was, But the kids were there, and the kids are kids no matter where you go, and had pictures taken with them, and they were hawking their stuff. But he'd also explained that a lot of the children were orphaned because their parents got killed with all these mines. And so they brought them to the Buddhist temples, and they trained and they taught them Buddhism. And, for 1, 2, or 3 or 4 years, they had these youngsters that were dressed in, the orange Buddhist garb. And their objective was to give them food and also to educate them. And they said that the literacy rates went from 35, plus the life expectancy has gone up from 40. Today it's closer to 70 over the years, and he broke it down in the number of years that this happened with the changes of policies in the government. You know, it's a kingdom, and trying to make things better for their people. And the key thing was education. And these children came in, they taught them, and they just took them to class and taught them. And then he also, you know, he had a goal and objective of being successful in life. He, as he said, looking forward. And he worked very hard learning English, and he's a tour guide. But he also mentioned, I says, glad to see you. You're the first one in 6 months. You know, Viking is, I guess, one of the few ocean vessels that go into Cambodia. But he was very happy, just great people. Well, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it, and I thought I'd share that with you. But a lot of people don't realize that the reason that we have Schedule 1 marijuana is not because it's super duper bad. I mean, let's face it, it's legal in Canada. You know, that's 39 million people live up there. California, Oregon, and Washington, and Montana, and Idaho. You know, we have, just so you know, throw them up, you know, throw them in jail for 6 months or a year, make them a felon, then they can't vote. Pocatello has a women's prison, and Idaho has the highest incarceration rate for women in the United States, 125 per 100,000, whereas the rest of the country's about 65, 70. Why is that? It's because cheap labor. I was out at a wellness park in Pocatello, and I saw these 2 women riding on these lawnmowers. And I asked the Pocatello parks guy, and I said, who are those women? Oh, she said, oh, they're from the prison. They were having a ball. They were laughing, riding these lawnmowers. And I said, well, how much do they get paid doing that? 50 cents an hour. 50 cents an hour, and they're building other prisons. And of course, it's profitable because they're private. You know, drugs are a terrible thing, but putting youngsters in jail and taking away the 1,400 rights, civil rights, plus, you know, they come out with tattoos. You notice the tattoos? You know, they have that in the prisons. They use piano wire to make these tattoos, make them tough. I don't know if that's always the case, but to me it is, because I've been in other parts of the world, they don't have tattoos like that. Even in Los Angeles, I was there in January, and I noticed there's no tattoos. Why do we have so many in Idaho? Because they've been in prison. So anyway, off to Bangkok. Really enjoying this trip. It was part of my bucket list. I'm the oldest one on this trip at 81, by the way. Everybody else about 78, 70. You know, we had to fill out a form, and I noticed I was born in 1944, and everybody else was like, 58. You know, that's it. So I hope you'll learn something from this, because really, when I talk to people, they don't know on this trip, and they're in their 70s, they don't know about the drugs because they've never been in service. They didn't live it like I did, and they had the experience like I had. A lot of people haven't had those experiences, so they can't connect the dots. And you might say I'm wrong, but I'm not. We need to decriminalize marijuana. Too many youngsters are not able to vote and not part of society as a result of that. We've got a drug problem, of course, that came as a result of the Vietnam War in this country. And, it's going to take a long time to get rid of it, but not as long as you keep locking up all these kids. Make it a great day. It's October 30th, 2025. And I'm in I'm in Sinoukville, Cambodia.